There we go. So I wanted to start by introducing our speaker today, Jeff Cheezy Morgan. So he is the CEO of Industrial Logic Canada. He's been teaching and coaching teams about agile and also lean techniques for a long time, right? More than 15 years.
Wait, I'm only 25. How?
So since he was 10 years old. And a lot of his work is focused on engineering practices for developers and testers. And so more recently, the last few years, he's had a lot of success and recognition for his work in continuous delivery. So I think today's topic is going to be a great one, and really happy to have him here. So feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen quickly. And let's see. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so just a couple of minutes ago, I made a change to this slide, and that change added this animation that I'm about to do. There you go. Realistically, I have no idea how many times we deploy a month anymore in the group that I'm going to talk about. So knowing that I was going to talk about it today, I thought, well, I should probably get some sort of an idea. So I went out around 1:30 today. That just the group I'm going to talk about, there's 3 separate products, and each product has its own Dora dashboard. And so I went out for the product that I've worked the most with lately. And by 1:30 today, they had 26 production deployments. So I decided to scratch and put 2,000 on here, but I actually have absolutely no idea how many that is anymore. So anyway, so there you have it. Hi, everybody. Jeff Morgan, most people know me as Cheezy. And I have to do a quick plug. Modern Agile, if you haven't heard of it, it's Agile that kind of works for geeks, to be quite honest. So yeah, especially it brings in a lot of the modern thinking that I think is missing from so many of the Agile methodologies out there, specifically the experiment and learn rapidly, which we know comes from lean startup, and continuous delivery, which comes from excellence. And yes, I work for Industrial Logic Canada. That is a maple leaf, not a pot leaf. That is the shadow there, just so that we're clear. And let's get started. So I want to start by just talking about what I'm not going to talk about today. And I think because I'm going to mention it, I can no longer say I'm not going to talk about it. But anyway, here we go. I'm not going to talk about why continuous delivery is the best way to build software and deliver software. Why? I've talked about that many, many times in the past. I'm getting tired of talking about that. I'm not going to talk about why I believe it builds products that are more focused on user needs. Again, I've talked about that constantly. And we should all know that that Agile, the manifesto itself says, this is a quote from the Agile manifesto, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. That's where the term continuous delivery came from. These, if you want to know about these or you want to understand what I think about these, go out and look it up. Here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a very specific client that I'm still working for. I'm not going to talk about who the client is, although it might slip out accidentally, I guess. And this client we've had a journey from when I started there, where they were releasing software every 2-3 months or so, to a place now where software is released many, many times a day. And I'm going to talk about where we ended up. And I'm going to give some very, very specifics around the things that I think are important for us getting there. Teams and org structure. We'll spend just a little bit of time talking about that. We'll talk about what our process looks like. It probably doesn't look like any Agile you've seen, and that's maybe a good thing. We're going to talk a little bit about our testing approach, or maybe I should say, how do we achieve quality? Because again, it's different than probably the way most people work. I'm going to talk a little bit about our release pipeline. What does that look like? And then we're going to kind of finish by maybe with a question and answer session. So what do I really want to have happen? Well, I want you to understand the mechanics, not the why you should do it, build better products, etc. But I want you to kind of feel a little bit of the implementation, if you will, the mechanics of how this works, at least in this organization. Now, I can't see you when I'm showing my slides. I can't see you, and I know how frustrating it is to, if you've got a question, to try to hold it till the end, only to forget what you were going to ask or to lose the context. So I'm going to ask you guys for a favor. As we're talking about this, if you have a question or you want me to elaborate on something, or you want to say, that's total bullshit, or you want to say, that will fucking never happen here, just shout it out, except maybe not with the F word, but just shout it out, because I can't see you. And if you try to raise your hands, I won't see that. But I would rather have it be more of a dialogue than me just like talk. And then at the end, everybody try to answer questions. So will you guys do that for me?
Hell yeah.
At least somebody answered. Good. So maybe that's a good start. So, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the teams, only because there were some things that are unique about the way we ended up that I think deserve some discussions. So a team, there's typically 4 to 5 developers on a team. So there's one product owner, and that product owner is dedicated to the team. They work with the team. Before COVID, they sat with the team, and very often when the team was mob programming, they were mobbing with the team as well. So there are designers, but in this specific area, the designers are not dedicated to teams. They kind of work across teams. If you want to know some specifics, there are 3 types of designers. There are interaction designers, there are content designers, and there are graphic designers. So they're really, really interested in the usability and the usefulness of the app. So across this whole group that I'm going to talk about, there were 22 teams that were like this in 3 specific product groups. So you could think about it like this. So these were the delivery teams. 2 of the product groups had 9 teams, they're larger products, and one of them had 4 teams. So there also were these things that we called leadership teams. And in there would be a product manager, somebody from operations. And the reason we did that is because there are a lot of operational concerns, along with some of the changes that we're making. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But instead of having to write documentation, instead of having to constantly have meetings to inform people, we decided just to bring somebody onto the team so that they were there and they could handle or take care of any of the operational needs necessary. There's an architect, and there are designers, like a design lead. So each of those products have that leadership team. Last but not least, in this big group, so now we're at 25 teams. There is one additional team, which is called a platform team. Now, we intentionally didn't call them DevOps because we don't believe DevOps itself is a team. In fact, most of the responsibility for what you might call a DevOps team actually resides with the developers. So the platform team, what they did was their responsibility was really around making sure the software was running, patched properly. So for example, they had the responsibility to make sure that Jenkins was our pipeline tool, was there, that there were enough resources, etc. But they didn't create the pipelines. The teams created their own pipelines. Everything was checked in as code. They had the responsibility to make sure that we had an internal Git to make sure that it was there, but the teams kind of managed how it was. So that's why we kind of the runtime environment where things ran, they had the responsibility to make sure it was there, but the specific container that the code that the team's code ran in, the teams were responsible for. I think I heard someone come in.
Yeah, I noticed that Michael raised his hand.
Yeah.
So he has a question.
Yeah, I was going to wait until you finish the slide, but you mentioned that the leadership team had people from ops. I assume that, and actually I'm glad that I waited. How does that, like, is ops the same as the platform team? And by ops, do you mean like server operations, or because like in some businesses, ops means legal and finance and the building manager and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So let me just thanks. Great question, Michael. It doesn't mean server ops at all. Okay. It means there are massive call centers where people receive calls. It means there are branch offices where there are physical brick and mortar where communication needs to happen. Things of that nature. So what they call operations is more of it, not what we might think of as in a technical way as operations, as in, my server, my platform, my whatever it might be, my cloud, whatever. But this is more from a business perspective. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I have a question for everybody here. What roles are missing? What's not here? Because I've just told you everybody that's there. So what do you not see?
No QA.
There are no testers and no QA. That's right. There's not a QA person anywhere on any of these teams. Why do you think that's the case?
Developers are responsible for it.
Maybe that's it. Yeah. What we believe that adding QA actually would drive quality lower than what we have right now. So what else is missing? What else don't you see here?
You didn't mention different roles of dev, like front end versus back end.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether I should I should infer that it's absent or you were just not mentioned.
Michael, that's a great question. It's not absent, and it's blurred in some teams, and in others it's not. I'll tell you what, whenever I get into talking about the way that we're testing, I will go into that in more detail, okay? Because I am calling out the front end and the back end at that point, okay? You notice I'm not mentioning Scrum Master. There's no Scrum Masters here. Do any of you work with Scrum Masters?
No.
So if you work in an agile-like fashion, there is a role called a Scrum Master. We decided that we actually didn't need that role, and what largely because the teams really had a solid continuous learning loop that they implemented. And so, but there is a need for somebody to kind of do a little bit of coordination around, getting the team together for different things that they want to meet about or whatever. And so what we've decided is that the teams can kind of figure out how to do that themselves. Some of the teams found like a little wheel thing that they would have, and every 2, 3, 4 weeks or so, they would spin the wheel and it would randomly pick somebody and say, okay, now you're it for the next 3 weeks or whatever. So, so they would kind of take turns in that role. So the team structure, very flat, very, very small, very focused. So I thought that I would call that out. Maybe the QA piece, no QA, might be the most interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Any other questions just about the structure of the teams? Let's talk about the process.
Hey,
So,
Cheezy, I got one actually.
okay,
Where's the manager?
manager.
Boss.
So,
Whatever.
yeah, there are some managers here. They're not in this picture, okay? But there are managers outside that people report to. So, for example, the developers have managers that they report to, but that weren't part of the team, weren't part of the delivery organization. So I didn't put them here. So let me give you an idea of the size. This is a company that has probably, you know, well over 100,000 employees. So it's a very, very big company. And this is only one area inside of that large company that we did this. So there absolutely is some overhead that exists outside of the delivery, but and if you want to talk about that, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. Good. Looks like you don't want to talk about it.
No. I just wondered if, you know, some teams have them right embedded on the team, but clearly you guys don't. It's not a focus. So
we had some goals whenever we talked about our agile process. Number one, we wanted it to be very, very lightweight. We wanted the process to we didn't want the people to have to really think about it too much. You know, we wanted it to not impose a lot of process or a lot of restrictions on the team. We wanted the team to be able to focus on delivering software instead of the process itself. So it was very important that it not be heavyweight. So there was no attempt whatsoever to standardize. Although we did set up some kind of loose guardrails, the teams were allowed to kind of design within that how they wanted to do it. So, for example, if you would go, yes, we're using Jira, but if you'd go look at the team's Jira boards, probably every team's is different. And the teams probably change their board every 3, 4, 5 months or so. You know, it's up to them. They how they do everything, they change. So the key thing for us was that what we wanted to do is we wanted to establish this mindset, which is that, you know, hey, as a team, we should not be content with where we are, but we should always kind of challenge ourselves to get better at our game. You know, we should really focus in on how do we improve as individuals, but more importantly, how do we improve as teams? So let's talk about the process. So some of the things that I said, we did put some guardrails in place. So one of the things that we said is that we don't want to use Scrum, because whenever you're delivering very rapidly, most of the elements of Scrum, a lot of them become completely meaningless. For example, what benefit does a 1 week or 2 week time slot or time box make? It makes no difference, you know, meaningless if you're deploying, you know, to production every single day. Release planning, yeah, that kind of doesn't really fit here, because part of the idea of continuous delivery is we deliver things very rapidly, and then we learn from that and we adjust based on that learning. So release planning, yeah, if you're planning something out pretty far in advance, you're making some serious mistakes. Even around sprint planning, who wants to go through some effort and say, here's what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks, and where you get somebody that try to pressure you to do more and to get that all encompassing commitment out of you, so that they could be used against you potentially. So we decided that we wanted to try to achieve a continuous flow. Most of the teams ended up creating boards, their team Kanban boards, that go all the way from the first time we discuss an idea all the way to production. And that might sound like a really long board, but it actually is not. In fact, I'll get into that hopefully in detail in a couple of slides. We wanted to do just-in-time grooming. And of small tasks. What is just-in-time? So most of the teams, they have a column on their board that somehow represents the stories that they've kind of talked about. And most of them have put a WIP limit on that of 1 or 2, maybe 3. So that there are a few things there, but that whenever that starts to go down, they would call up, since the teams are a lot of times mobbing or working very closely together, they would try to do grooming just, a half a day, maybe a day or so before we actually need it. Small tasks, what are the small tasks? Well, I think all of the teams, their goal is from the time that we start working on something, it's in production in about a day, or worst case 2 days. So they're really trying to focus in on having the work items that work across our board be very, very small altogether. Low WIP. Work in progress was the thing that we really spent a lot of time with the teams talking about, which is that, the goal is never to see how much work we can start, but the goal is to focus in on how much work can we finish, and to watch those, to set really tight WIP limits on your board, to spend more time collaborating, to not feel like we had to be utilized, to make sure we have plenty of Slack, and during Slack, have a list of things that we might want to address in those Slack times. And we taught the teams to swarm around constraints. So let's say, for example, that we have something that seems to be stuck on our board. It's the second day and it hasn't moved. That the team probably should drop what they're doing and step out and try to find a way that we can move that thing forward. So retrospectives with actionable outcomes. So again, this goes back to that continuous learning that we talked about. It's not that we just get together and have a happy fest, but instead we come together and we talk about what is the next experiment we want to run as a team. We talk about what we expect to see. We talk about how we'll know if we were successful or not. And in many cases, we talk about what data we might try to collect along the way. So in other words, we talk about our retrospectives with actionable outcomes. So we really want to have the teams constantly experimenting. And again, that's part of why we said no, teams don't need to follow some predefined process, because the team is going to own it. Believe it or not, that's the entirety of the process. That's the yes. Let's talk about the no. There's no sprints, no story points, no estimation, no velocity, no scrum masters. I said that already, I guess. So there's no process standardization. There was no attempt to say that everybody should kind of be the same. Although what we really saw was that it kind of happened, sort of, in that teams started sharing things that they learned, and other teams said, well, let me try it as well. So even though whenever we started this, I thought, well, every team's going to be completely different. They're not a lot different. I mean, there are differences from every team, but a lot of things ended up being the same. Again, that not because anyone told them to, that anybody said that the team should all do X, Y, or Z, but it was more because they were sharing with each other, the teams would talk, etc. Okay, I think this is my last slide to talk about the process. So there were a couple of things that these next 3 bullets that I'm going to show you here were things that as a group, we worked to and we agreed across all the products to adopt. So first of all, for a user story, our definition of done is that it's deployed. So there's that's the pure definition. So we have these things called features that multiple stories roll up to. And our definition of done for a feature is that it's been released. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but release is not the same as deployed in this context. So developers own the stories, developers know about that, but the feature and the feature release is something that the product owner on the team owns. And I'll get into that just a little bit. We're running lots of experiments, a lot of experiments with our users live in production. And so how do we know when we're finished with an experiment? Well, we're finished with an experiment whenever we've gotten the feedback, either from interviewing users or gathering data or whatever it might be. If we had multiple versions of code out there, we've cleaned up and we've settled on one, and feature toggles have been removed, etc. So in other words, the experiment is done once we've gone through maybe all of the different various iterations or permutations of that experiment that we might want to run. We've decided on which one we think is the right option for us, and we've done the cleanup around that. So that's how we define an experiment as done. So that's the process. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts, questions. Nobody cares about that. This is an XP group. Somebody was oh, I heard somebody. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just ask if you're in a place that doesn't have like a shared definition of done, how do you go about it?
So good question. If I would go back or think about a slide that I showed a little bit earlier, which is that there actually are kind of three primary products that are being worked on with multiple teams delivering on that product. And so whenever I first started with that group, the definition of done, for example, for a story was that, yeah, we've tested it. It's now we've created a pull request or something like that, right? So it was an evolution, to be quite honest, but we had to move as a product group together because it was in many cases largely some of the same code base, or at least the same services. There were large Angular front ends that were shared across the different teams and such. So there was a need to kind of have a common group. Of the three product teams, one of the teams made the journey first. One of the product groups made it first, and we sort of came up with these definition of done, these definitions, and as the other teams followed behind, they just adopted them and went forward. So I don't know that I have a great suggestion for you, but if you're in the same code base and if you're working on the same product, there is a lot of benefit to having some basic definitions around that. So how would I go about that? I don't know. I guess I would just have a conversation with the teams. What I'm talking to you guys is kind of where we ended up and where we are right now. So it's not, most of that journey. But by the way, let me give you an idea of how long we're talking about. It's taken about 2 years to go from where they were to where they are right now. So this was a slow process, a lot of learning, a lot of growth along the way. And so although I'm throwing these ideas out here like, yeah, here, there, there was a lot of work to get there. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question well. In fact, I don't think I did. Sorry about that. But I don't have a magic formula that I can give you that's going to work everywhere.
That was super helpful. Thank you. I think, again, start with the conversation and recognize it's going to take time?
So one of the things that we did somewhat early in this journey is we decided to adopt Dora Metrics as the way that we measure ourselves. And is everybody here familiar with the Dora Metrics, or should I talk about those real quickly?
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dora stands for DevOps, Research and Analytics. It's part of Google Cloud now. If you've ever read the book Accelerate, the ideas originated as some research, and I'll mention a couple of the metrics. One is deployment frequency. So how frequently do you deploy to production? Deploying to a quote unquote test environment doesn't count. So deployment frequency, lead time for change, and what that measurement is from the time that you commit code, on average, how long is it before that code's in production? So mean time to recovery. So if you make a mistake, how long does it take to revert or to resolve that issue? And then change failure rate is the fourth one, which is whenever you make changes, what percentage of those changes result in some sort of an error? And these all relate to production, although we decided that our pipeline was production as well. So any of those things that occur in the pipeline, so for example, a pipeline that fails because a test failed, for example, or a pipeline that fails for whatever reason is a failure. So that gets added into the change failure rate, because in the space that we're living in, if our pipeline is not running and it's not green, then we have no way to resolve production issues. If production has a problem, we're out of luck in that case. So that's why we pointed that rigor to our pipeline as well. So we started measuring those metrics, and those metrics are really beautiful because they measure outcomes. They don't measure how you get there, right? So when you think of something like deployment frequency, it's just a number. How many times did you deploy to production, over a period of time? It doesn't say, are you doing waterfall? Are you doing Scrum? Are you doing something like terrible, like safe? Or are you doing Kanban or lean, or what are you? It just measures outcomes. And it's something that a team can start to think about and really have conversations around how do we improve these things. And we found that drove a lot of the right behavior. So internally, we built a dashboard that pulls this data together as well. So the teams have access to that.
Does this kind of workflow necessarily imply trunk-based development?
Yes, I'm going to get into that.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on?
I do have a question.
Okay.
So if you're not measuring velocity and you're not doing estimation, at some point there is a business person who holds the purse strings that wants to know, am I getting a good return on my money, or I have a market deliverable that I need to hit in 3 or 6 months or whatever. How do I know whether I'm likely to hit that need or not?
Yeah, that's really old thinking, and we don't have that here. So that idea is one of projects, right? And so as opposed to a continuous flow of product delivery. Again, remember that original modern agile idea. So delivering world-class products, where we have like these roadmaps of where we have product people who go out and get budget to do projects and things like that is a great way to ensure that we don't deliver what the user wants, in my view. So because it's a way that where we don't sneak up on ideas, where we go into it assuming we know what our users want, instead of saying, I don't know what they want. Let me run experiments to have them tell me what is best for them. And so yeah, velocity is something that's related to Scrum. None of the teams are doing Scrum, so it's something that doesn't work at all for us. Estimation, I guess you could say that we're maybe doing some form of estimation, and that whenever the team comes up with the tasks that they're going to work on, I mentioned that they try to break them down so that they become of a size that they can get them to production in a day or two. So that's maybe sort of a form of estimation, but we never, ever, ever, ever have these cases where somebody comes and says, here's this very large epic. I want you to break it down into stories. Then I want you to put an estimate with all of the stories. And we're going to roll those estimates up. And we're going to come up with some big estimate. And that's how we'll know how much budget we have to get. Because that's a 20-year-old thinking that we know from our industry that, huge percentage of the software that we build in that approach aren't really used by customers or rarely used. So I guess the product mindset's quite different here. Maybe I should get into that. Actually, in some of my other talks, I do.
So I don't mean necessarily like, fixed price, fixed capabilities, but, I don't know, 6 months from now, I need to have, I can't think of a great example, some sort of reporting subsystem that does X, Y, Z. Are we able to hit that in broad strokes?
That's not a developer decision. That's a product decision, right? So do they want to prioritize working on that now or not? Is what it comes down to. But again, I'll go back to, if you're doing planning for 6 months from now, okay, and there might be things that drive that. Okay, there might be some compliance things or some legal things or whatever that cause that, but in this approach, we don't work in big ideas. Okay, we work in continuous flow of small ideas. So the prioritization of what those are comes completely from the product person. So if they know that, hey, I have this legal requirement that I have to meet in 6 months from now, then they might come to the team and say, hey, I've got this big legal thing that I need to hit. Here's the 20-second definition of what it is. What do you think? And they might say, probably 2 weeks or so, in which case now, but they would never do anything more than that. And now it becomes the product person's prerogative on when do they do that. If they don't need that for 6 months, though, they probably won't start it for 5 months.
So do you do like long-term roadmap planning?
No. Nope, absolutely not. That's something that we wouldn't do.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
See, again, long-term roadmap planning assumes that you know what the future is. And it bakes into it assumption that you know what your customers need. So the modern agile approach is to experiment and learn. Not assume that you know what, and not assume that I have any idea what's going to happen a year from now, but instead think about what's the highest value thing that I want to think about right now. How can I run an experiment to learn? How can I take the data that I gathered, drive it right back into product design and product ideas to get the best product possible? So I'm going to move on because you're slowly pulling me into some of the topics that I said I wasn't going to talk about today. And I want to get into some of the technical stuff, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. So, some of the principles or ideas that drive our approach to testing. Number one, I want it to be completely repeatable. I don't want to have tests that are fickle, tests that fail for unknown reasons, or tests that when they fail, I have to go out and spend time to understand why did they fail. Did they fail because there's a bug in the system, or did they fail because something's wrong in some environment or some data is wrong or whatever? I wanted the testing to be thorough. We wanted it to be fast. We wanted to get very fast feedback loops. This idea of regression testing is one that we wanted to completely get away from, because that idea is one that, you know, we're going to develop for a period of time. They were going to pause and go back and make sure we didn't break anything. But we instead decided we wanted to get to a place where we can know, you know, at any time, what is the state of our system. We also wanted to make sure that we did not have test environments, because test environments are evil. They create more problems than what they solve. In that you know, most companies I've worked with, there are no two test environments that are the same, and they're not even remotely close to what production is like. So if we reached a point where we felt like we had to have an environment in order to verify something, we wanted to be able to take a different approach. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into some of the details about the code and the approaches that we took for that. So
I assume that also means no staging environments.
that's right. Well, I'll tell you what, so our production, we've got an A/B production environment. Okay, let me hold that off, because I'm going to talk about that in just a short while. I've got a slide that talks about that. Okay, but just to give you a 5-second tickler, we do have an A/B production environment. So my pipeline will deliver something to, or sorry, a blue-green, and my pipeline will deliver out to a blue environment. And where we are right now is that those environments flip on an interval. So I do have the ability to test something in the blue before it goes live in green, although that's something that we're working to get rid of right now. So that'll be gone, but that's kind of where we are right now. Okay. I said I'd talk about front end and back end. Now, here you could see the front end was all Angular. The back end used to be all Spring Boot, which is Java. But I can tell you that now a lot of the teams are writing their services tier in Node. So we have a combination of both. And how did that happen? Well, that happened because a team decided to test it. And so we decided, okay, let's go with it. So some of this service layer right now, I'm going to say probably the majority is still written in Spring, maybe 15-20% or so of the services now are in Node. And then behind it, there is a bunch of other stuff. There's a mainframe, actually a few different mainframes. There's the Kafka backbone. There's Mongo databases, other enterprisey services that we call. Most of those things in yellow, we actually don't own. Some of them we do. So that it's sort of a hodgepodge that you might expect to see in any really large enterprise company. And I'm going to talk about how we tested the functional and non-functional requirements, but let me get started on the functional side of things. And I'm going to start by talking about Angular. If you're an Angular developer, maybe you'll appreciate this. I'm going to jump into some specific tools. So Jess was our unit testing tool. If you've done much Angular development, you know that it has this thing called test bed, which if you're not an Angular developer, I'll give you a quick description. One of the things Angular does is it does a lot of automatic dependency injection, where the dependencies that are defined for a component are automatically injected in. Test bed is sort of a testing, for lack of a better term, a base class almost, where it does all of that automatic wiring up of those dependencies for you, as well as some other things. It actually inflates the virtual DOM and some other things like that. But those tests tend to run slow because it does all of that thing. And so what we started doing right away is we started creating two inner describe blocks, one where we don't use test bed, where we literally inject our own mock mistakes into the code tested. And does someone have a question? Okay. That are just plain old objects or functions or whatever. And if for some reason we actually needed to access the DOM, which wasn't very often at all, we would tightly wrap that down in a test bed. And the reason for that was because we wanted our tests to run fast. We created another type of tests that we called component tests, maybe not the best name, but that's what we use. And these are tests that would actually call out of process. But we created our own mocks because none of our testing crosses architectural layers in the app. So we would write express mocks for that. Some teams actually have played around with test frameworks that actually would drive through the UI, so they would actually start up the Angular app, but they tended to abandon those over time. These are just a little bit larger in scope. We use snapshots, and if you don't know what that is snapshots are kind of a double-edged sword. It's something in Jest where literally what it does is you point it to an area of your DOM, and it will, the first time you run it, it will save that out onto file system. Subsequent times you run that test, what it would do is it would compare that portion of the DOM in its current state against the previously saved state. And so we introduced these for a very, very specific reason. One of the main apps that has, like, you know, just to give you an idea, usually 500,000 plus concurrent users on this app. There is a version for businesses and there's a version for individuals. And we reuse components, Angular components across those two, but sometimes we needed to make changes. And so we had a couple of issues where one of those reusable components, it was changed for one of those products, but it accidentally, that change leaked over to the other side. And so what we started doing is whenever we were finished with something and we said, okay, this is probably not going to change anymore, you know, and we want to make sure it doesn't change, we would create a Jest snapshot around that thing that we don't want to change. So again, this was more of a precaution that if this thing is being reused in another area and it accidentally changes it over here, I want it to fail. So that was the purpose of the Jest snapshots. The developers, I taught an exploratory testing class, which if you don't know what it is, it's a manual testing technique. And so the developers learned how to rapidly basically mitigate named risks or identified risks. But we would do that on our local machine running against those express mocks. And we have a way set up, some scripts set up that allow us to very, very rapidly vary the data that are being returned back from my mock. So I can play a lot of what ifs. What if the data is like this? What if this happened? What if I get this? What if this error occurs or whatever? So there's some exploratory testing that takes place. The final thing is that we do have, as a developer, if I think that I finished up this thingy, I will ask my product owner, hey, and the designer, or not always the designer, but to take a quick look at it. And again, this is all happening on my local machine. There's not a test environment to do this on. So the final thing is, if I think that there might be some additional exploratory testing that I want to do, but for whatever reason, I really want to be in an integrated environment, then I can actually do that in production, because we're feature toggling so many of our changes. It gives me the ability to go out to production with the code and to turn it on just for a small number of people, maybe just the team itself, to take a look at something, to do additional testing. But that's not really happening that often. Mostly when that happens is whenever we're integrating with something that's new and maybe somewhat unique. Okay, let me go into the middle tier. By the way, I should update this for the node services, but I don't have it updated. The node services would be somewhat similar to what you saw on the front end, and that we'd be driving them with just the unit tests. And we would
Can I ask
also.
a quick question before you move to this?
Yes.
When it comes to feature flag, like the feature flag approach on production,
Yeah.
how do you do that without it being that whenever you make a change to something, you always have to like duplicate the component, or have like endless if else things in your code?
We don't have any if else's for feature toggle. So it's really about design. Okay. And so the teams have a lot of conversations about that before we start a new quote unquote feature. We talk about what's the simplest, least intrusive way that we could possibly toggle this. Sometimes it causes us to have to write additional code, but writing the additional code is more important than having messy code. Let me give a very simple example, and let me give a complex example, okay? Or actually, I'm going to put you off because I talk about feature toggles later.
Okay.
Is it okay if we get into it whenever I talk about it in a little while? Oh, okay, great. The Spring services, yeah, we're using JUnit 5. And again, the same reason we walked away from or rarely use the Spring Boot test. If you aren't familiar, it's a test that again wires everything up, injects everything in much the same way as the framework I was mentioning in the Angular. So we again try to just use pure unit tests. They're much faster, and so on. So we also have this idea of component tests that we've created, and we're going against WireMock for those component tests. Again, these tend to not be something that goes through the front end, but these tend to be something that maybe I want to test something a little bit larger in scope than what my unit tests would test, because our unit tests typically are testing something incredibly small in isolation. So some of those backend services that I showed, the yellow things, remember, that where I talked about we don't own all of those. We had some challenges early on, that especially some of the enterprisey type services, which is where we would have one of those groups come to us and say, hey, we just made a change. We need you to do a complete end-to-end thorough regression test and sign off that our change doesn't break anything for you. And we're like, what the hell? That what do you think? You think this is 1990? That really doesn't work. And so we started convincing some of them to let us put contract tests in place, where we kind of define, here's the minimal set that we think that you need to be able to maintain, and here's some tests for that. And then we would work with them to write some tests. And basically we were able to get to a place, not universally, but in some of the places where, hey, don't contact us unless if this test fails. And if this test fails while you're in development, let me know right away. Don't wait until you're, and so anyway, so that was something that we put in place for that. We did set up to do some exploratory testing on the services layer in much the same way that we were on the UI, that we created Postman templates, and those got checked in with the services. So as did, by the way, all the WireMock messages as well. So I literally can fire up my service locally, have it talking to mocks, and then I've got these Postman templates that allow me to easily make calls into the front end. And this is so that I could test. The form of exploratory testing we did is what's called risk-based. So we would only do this if we had identified a very specific risk up front. but it was a way for me to kind of simulate the call coming from the front end or from whoever my consumer was, and a way for me to simulate my downstream service maybe that I'm talking to or whatever. So that's kind of what we did with the services. Like I said, if we wanted to do some full integrated type exploratory testing here, we could do that in production. So what you don't see here is end-to-end automation. We walked away from that largely because we didn't want to have tests that were unreliable, tests that failed consistently or inconsistently for reasons that we don't know. We didn't want to have environments that we had to worry about. We didn't want to have data set up, etc. So we very, very much went away from that. As you also notice, the automated tests that we have, they test individual components, but that, individual pieces, but that have already mocks for them so that I can write a little bit larger tests, but that they can go down a pipeline individually. So in other words, my service doesn't rely on other things in order to run the test for it, etc. Okay, I'm going to keep going only because there's still plenty of things to talk about. Non-functional requirements. So for the Angular, developers were responsible for visual inspection, and we sort of had a set of browsers and devices that we supported, but there was no effort to say, okay, everything has to be tested on all of these because that was just too much overhead. We built a lot of Angular components and UI elements that we reused, which kind of eased a little bit of that. Only times whenever we would really focus in on a different browser or maybe a different mobile device would be whenever we would hear something from the field that, hey, this version of iOS on this iPad doesn't work right or whatever. So, but the teams would try to think about that responsive. So the teams were responsible for testing the breakpoints and accessibility. Teams that the UI was responsible for accessibility as well. If we look at other things, we had security tests running in the pipeline. We had, oh my goodness, I can give a whole talk around our load performance test, because if you don't have an environment, how do you run a load and performance test? Well, actually, that's a great question. We actually built out these really smart mocks that actually got data from production so that they can mimic more response times and latencies that we were seeing in production and allow us to test individual components around expectations. So that I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, or I'll take the entire remainder of our conversation here talking about that, but it's really, really slick what we were able to put together there. We had we had multiple external vendors that we would have do pen testing for us every quarter. We would rotate through those vendors. And so that was the entirety of our testing approach. I do want to say one thing, because I think I said earlier that I would answer a question, and I'm not sure that I did. So there was this conversation about front end and back end. And we did not say that people had to only be front end developers or only back end developers. What we found was that there was a lot of the teams do a lot of mob programming. And so over time, the developers became comfortable, if you will, working in both. I think also the teams where they started experimenting with and started writing services in Node, they really wanted to go to a place where every developer could touch, and be very confident around every piece of the stack that they owned. So some teams, though, they'd still have this distinction between front end and back end. So I think it's that each team kind of worked out what seemed to work the best for them. So, I don't remember who asked that question earlier, but I hope I at least touched on it well enough for you. What do you think of the testing approach? You guys are so quiet.
I wish I knew how to get to this place.
Slowly. Remember, I said we've been working on this for more than 2 years now. Any questions, thoughts, comments, arguments?
In some ways, that seems fast to me. I've definitely worked places where they didn't make it a quarter of that far in 2 years.
So this is going to sound odd, or maybe it's not going to sound odd, but I would say that the primary driver for the success here was the leadership. Yeah, and we're talking senior VP level. The guy who's over this area, he is a true believer, and he was the driver behind it. And he wasn't afraid to go out and talk to other senior leaders to build us the space for this. So Nick, I can tell you, the very first time we did a live deployment in the middle of the day with users on the system, we had VPs who were like shaking, and everybody was watching. Everybody was so nervous about it, but he had told people it's okay, it's going to be okay, and the fact that it went off without a hitch only fueled this. And to be quite honest, as we started seeing success and we started seeing very, very, very low defect count, and we started seeing the pace at which we're able to deliver change, it sort of started fueling itself like a little bit. There have been some challenges, though. Actually, ask me about the challenges when I get to the end, because I think I've got a couple of interesting challenges that I'll mention to you that you probably wouldn't think of. Any other questions about the testing approach?
Who's making sure that the end-to-end user workflows are as the product design team really wants them to be? Is that the development team, or are product managers doing that?
I would say it's both. Okay, it's definitely both. So I'm going to get into our release pipeline in just a moment, and what you're talking about kind of rolls up into that. Okay. And the decision around making and releasing something.
Thanks.
In fact, let me go on to that.
Are you going to talk about team boundaries and service boundaries, that sort of thing?
I wasn't. You have a specific area you would be interested in, or?
I'm just wondering how, like, the workflow you're describing seems like it would work best, so certainly best, or maybe exclusively, if each deployable thing is owned by one team.
Yeah, so that's clearly not the case here. So let me talk about the product that one of those 3 products that I've worked the most in. The Angular is one monorepo. Okay, so there are 2 Angular apps that are built out of it. Okay. And some shared components that are also built out of it, but it's just one simple monorepo, and any of those 9 teams have the ability to change any code anywhere in that repo. Likewise, the services tend to be so that we went with a pattern where we have separate repos for the services. Again, there's nobody that owns it, so it's owned by everybody. So if I have something that causes me to change anything, I can do that. So some of the ideas, can you tell me what your concern is, and maybe I can talk specifically about how we addressed that concern?
Like, I guess it seems like generally, like, how do I know I'm not, my changes aren't conflicting with changes being made by people that I'm not talking to? Like, if I'm only testing a single component, that's fine if I can rely on the other components around it not to change. But if other teams are changing the other components, it seems like I would want some sort of kind of relating to the previous question. I would want some sort of automated testing that ensures that things remain integrated.
Yeah. So again, if you have a specific integration risk, okay, you were worried about something, then that might be a call to do some exploratory testing once you deployed your code into production. Okay. So how do we make sure that my change doesn't break other things? Well, we have lots and lots and lots of automated tests. Okay. We can integrate our code constantly, continuously. Okay. So, and so those are the two big things. I guess there probably are other things that are a part of this. Number one, the way we're doing source code management maybe lends itself toward eliminating risk. The way we do our deployments, the way we run with feature toggles as well helps a lot in that area. So,
okay.
I mean, it's maybe a combination of these practices together that allow us to go rapidly into to not to say that mistakes aren't ever made, that they are, but they're not common.
Okay, thanks.
So when I talk about release pipeline, what I'm going to talk about is from the time I commit code until that time that code is in production, or some things related to that. And I want to start off by talking about source code management. So the first thing is that we decided that we want very, very small stories. Okay. So, and by the way, I don't wait to commit until my story is finished, but I want small changes. If I want to do a refactoring that's more than just a small change, I might make that a separate commit as well, just so that it would be easy to see that. No branches, everything's trunk based. Again, we couldn't fathom having the risk of branches and merging and delaying the integration along the way. So we went. So when I first started there, we had a development branch, and then we had feature branches off of the development branch. So it was a slow migration to get to trunk-based development, where we started removing branches, and we actually started removing environments at the same time. So that was a huge time saving, and removed so much risk from our system by doing that. Like I said, the majority of changes are behind a feature toggle. That's how I can go to production with incomplete changes. That's how I can go to production potentially with something that where I may or may not be, not ready to release it, but that we can make a decision at a later time that something's in a releasable state. Actually, a product person would make that decision. We don't do pull requests. So again, pull requests are something that delays the integration, and it's something that creates a pull on team members. And so every time I talk about this, there's a lot of reasons why people do pull requests, and they bring up a lot of situations where, well, what happens if we have a junior developer, or what happens if we're doing X, or what happens if this or that is going on, so what we found is that we could use things like pairing and mobbing to overcome the overwhelming majority of things that folks might normally say that the reasons why they need pull requests. We spent a lot of time thinking about Git hygiene. So, for example, everybody rebases constantly. We're rebasing. We're squashing our merges. So, and so if you would look at our Git log, it's really, really clean. Just one change after another. So it's easy to bisect or easy to pull something out if we decide that we needed to. But it's also very easy to follow through to understand the history and what's going on, as opposed to some other places where I've worked or what I've seen where at any given time it looks like a tornado if you look at a visual representation of the Git log, just because you've got so many different branches of code. I'm not talking about physical branches, but I'm talking about so many intertwined changes going on that is not easy to follow along. So that was a really, really important element for us.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So when do your unit tests run? Like, is that is there like a code quality gate before you can merge into or push up to the main, I guess it's called?
No, they so first of all, when do they run? As a developer, you probably absolutely need to run them locally, right? So that's one of the reasons why we also wanted them to be fast. So but no, you check in your code and the pipeline picks it up and it runs all of the tests at that time. So we don't have that.
Okay, so there's probably just like a minimal gate of like you must have synced down the latest before you can push up.
Yep, that's part of that Git. Remember the Git hygiene that I talked about. Okay.
Yep.
So you're as a developer, I might commit and push my code 4 times a day. I'm just going to use it, right? So the process that I would do is, okay, I think I'm at a place. Let me run all my tests. Great. Let me rebase. Now let me run all the tests again. Okay, it looks like I'm good. And now I can push that code out. I was going to talk about feature toggles. So our product owners own the feature toggle in production. And so what I mean by that is they control release. So remember earlier I was talking about definition of done. I said definition of a story is that it's deployed to production. The definition of a feature is that it's released. This would be something that would be a decision from the product owner. So somebody asked a little while ago, how do you make if you have something that's larger, that more of a workflow or some larger piece that you might want to release as a whole, and maybe you had 20 stories that rolled up into that piece, and maybe you've been developing for 2 weeks on it. Well, it's kind of up to the product owner, although the developers have been testing it all along the way, but the product owner might want to turn that toggle on for themselves, to go through to make sure everything looks good, to feel happy about it, and only then would they start to open that product owner, or sorry, that feature toggle up. So how do we toggle? This bullet's not completely accurate, because often what we do is we have a conversation about toggling whenever we start on something new, like a new feature. And here I'm going to jump into a little bit of the mechanics that I said that I would talk about later. A couple of ideas is that whenever we're getting ready to start this new thing, we have a conversation with what's the simplest, least intrusive way that I could toggle this new thing. So on the UI, for example, let's say I'm adding something completely brand new, but that the way you get to it, we're going to add a new link on a page that gets you to it. So the entirety of my feature toggle might be to toggle that link and toggle the route, so that The reason I toggle the link is so that now they can't, there's nothing there for them to click to get to the page. And I might toggle the route, which is an Angular thing for how do you get there, just so that someone couldn't guess and type a URL into the browser and hit it, and all of a sudden they get to it. And then all of the code changes that I'm making for that new thing, I don't necessarily need to worry about. So that might be like on the simple side of things. Let me take a much more complex scenario and kind of walk you through it. So let's say that I've got a class that has a fair amount of logic in it, and this change is going to cause me to make some changes to that logic in a few different places in this class. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to go out and put if conditions. If this toggle is on, run this code, otherwise this logic, otherwise run this other logic. So what I might do in that case is I might extract an interface and create a new implementation and create a factory that would return out the object, and my feature toggle would only exist inside of that factory. So now I can test drive the new implementation. For testing purposes, we can flip the toggle and I can test out the new code. But at the end, if the new code is what stays, that's assuming I'm on an experiment or something, or if it's designed to replace it, once that's fully released, okay, once it's fully released out to all of the users and there's no longer a need for that feature toggle, the cleanup's real easy. So I can go out and easily do that. You know, I'm going a little bit quick through it because there's a little bit more to it than the details that I just gave. But hopefully you could start to see the idea that we kind of design our code around the ideas that we need to have toggling. And the toggling, as I mentioned, is not only just to introduce a new feature, but in some cases, the toggling is there to run experiments with multiple versions of the code. So thinking about the design is a very important aspect of this. So we use segments and percentages for our rollouts. So I can say, I can define a segment up front where I could say, you know, I only want to roll this out by, in Canada, I might say by province. And so once it's out, the product owner can decide, let me turn this on for Ontario, but I want to do a little canary release. So let me just roll it out to 2% of the users in Ontario. Oh, it's looking good. Let me roll it up to 25%. Cool. Let me roll it out to all of Ontario. And next I'm going to do Quebec, for example, or whatever it might be. Yeah, goes without saying, you need to clean up the feature toggles when you're not using them anymore. Team owns their pipeline. It gets checked in. It runs all of the tests. I'm going to go a little bit rapidly because I'm running out of time. If there's a pipeline issue, clearly the team swarms around it. And most of our changes are deployed dark due to feature toggles. Production environment, a product owner decides when to turn on a feature and for whom. Production runtime configuration is checked into Git. The team owns that. And that's kind of it. I've got just a couple of things to summarize, and then I want to get to questions. Yeah, so there's a lot of focus on quality. I hope you can see that or feel that. And that's what allows this specific product group to rapidly deliver things, and you know, having the team own the process, own their pipeline, you know, etc., means that we have far less handoffs, that the team kind of crafts something that works for them, you know, and that they have ownership in it, to be quite honest, so that there's no more complaining about, oh, we have to do X because if they're doing X, it's because they decided to do it. So so eliminating those handoffs is a huge issue as well. So, okay, I think I got through everything. And I have a few minutes left. So are there any questions? Any questions?
One question that I put in the chat about, I guess, exactly an hour ago, is saving this question for toward the end. You mentioned that
You're not a Kiss fan, huh? You didn't shout it out loud. Oh, come on.
you mentioned that every team is like empowered to operate the way they want, and then you gave like an hour of, and here's how we operate. I imagine that most of that is consistent across the teams. I'm curious what the variability is. Like, what are the things that teams choose to do differently?
A lot of the things that I mentioned were variable things, but that the teams kind of sort of ended up doing similar things. So if I were to talk about what are the things that we decided up front, here's how we want it to work, and then we decided we want to use Kanban, okay, because our goal when we started was continuous delivery, and we knew that Scrum was fairly incompatible with that. So we started up front saying we want to use Kanban. We started up front saying, wow, I'm trying to think of what else. There wasn't a lot else. I mean, we started up front teaching them about impactful retrospectives and to really learn how to do that. And those were sort of the two things that we taught teams. And then we spent time learning about the impact of high work in progress, and how to recognize constraints. And then from there, the teams kind of went on their own. Of the three product teams, one of the teams got more focus early on. And so they kind of fell into certain ways of doing some of the things. For example, those definition of dones that I mentioned, the teams came up with that. That first product group came up with that. But as the other product groups were kind of following along and they decided, well, they've done it already, let's just sort of adopt it. But nobody said you should do this. But instead it was more of a, wow, what's working for this other team? Oh, that's working for them, let's try it, And so that even though I mentioned a lot of things, a lot of that kind of happened over time through a lot of experimentation. And there was, so what's different between the teams? I think right now, if you would go walk from team to team, some of the biggest differences would be the ceremonies that they have, when or how they might decide to have them, or even which ones they have. They kind of control that. Their Kanban boards. The teams have different Kanban boards. How they represent things, how they work like that. What else would be different? How frequently did they mob? How frequently did they pair? That's very much team kind of decided that those would probably be the big things. Now, is that because somebody came in and said everybody has to do everything else sort of the same? No, it kind of just, that's why I said, I think I had a slide where I said they kind of organically came to some of the same decisions, but it wasn't being pushed on them. It was more of a, so they started setting up initially cross team sharing, but then they decided, well, let's create some cross product group sharing things. And they created these, what they call chapters, which are to build more reusable components. For example, they created so that they have a commercial feature toggle product, but they wanted to create their own abstraction over it to add some additional capabilities. And so they built that out, and through those sharing, they decided to copy each other, I guess, to a certain degree. Yeah. So
I'm curious, like, is there, what is the medium for discussing those sort of things company wide? Like, is there like a mailing list? Is there a setting where multiple people get in a room to say, like, we are the people from across the multiple teams that want to talk DevOps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, across the company, there's not really anything, because there's maybe 25,000 developers across the company. So it's that and this one group that I'm talking about is the only group that's working in this way. There are other groups that have adopted various aspects. So but across this particular group, they've created these chapters to kind of share a little bit, but they're they really don't have some structure, if you will, to share like that. Other than, like I said, these technical chapters. So for example, one of the teams decided, hey, let's try to write a Node service. And so they went out and wrote a service for Node, and then it ended up in production. And other teams were like, what did you do? What is that? Show us what you did. And now maybe around 20% or so of the services are written in Node, for example, but there wasn't some group that said, thou shalt, oh, here's what you have to do. It kind of just happened, and so it was the leadership in that area that gave us the ability to experiment in this way and to do this as well. I think I mentioned that earlier, but beyond that, there really isn't anything. The product groups do get together maybe twice a year to have like a retrospective where, all 9 of the teams, for example, might have kind of a retrospective type thing. And we just tried, we did recently ran a little open space conference for one of the product groups, probably about 6 months ago or so, where literally we just took a day and said, let's run an open space, talk about whatever. There was a lot of sharing. And lo and behold, after we did it with one of the product groups, another product group said, hey, we wanted to do that too. So they did one. And so anyway, but there's no formal thing beyond that.
Okay.
I said earlier, ask me about something, unintended consequences or something that you didn't think would happen. So we ended up creating a situation where a lot of other areas of the organization hate us. Okay. Largely because we got a lot of internal excitement from leadership. People were talking about, oh, this group, look what they're doing. Wow. And we reached a point where we had to integrate with some other groups, and they were very, very negative. You guys don't even have testers. You don't test your code, or there was a lot of overt negativity that was thrown at the teams and such, as opposed to curiosity. Hey, how are you guys doing that? What are you doing? How are you doing things? So I'd seen that in some places, but it really came out in this at this place. So any other questions? Anthony, I should ask you, I think we're at time, are we, or not?
We are, yeah, we're a couple minutes over, but so we definitely appreciate the time, but if we can just see if anyone has any last minute questions before we break. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, thank you, Cheezy. This was excellent, really informative and inspiring. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This is really great.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot. It's inspiring.
So I'll be posting the video on YouTube, and I'll link it in Meetup. So if you go back to this meeting in the comments area, I'll link it there. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Cheezy, and hopefully we can get you back.
Absolutely.
All right, take care everybody.
Bye.